Part 1. Viking equipment. What made it boring yet essential for conquests. Hey guys. Tonight we begin with something that might sound thrilling at first, but don't worry, we'll keep it very, very calm. So dim your lights, grab a pillow, maybe stretch a little, and let's float gently into the world of Viking equipment. Yes, equipment. Not blood, not battles, not yet. Just the tools, the boring but essential things that allowed Norsemen to row across cold seas and occasionally annoy an entire continent. Vikings had a reputation. You've heard it. Horned helmets, long ships slicing through waves, axes flying through the air, and raiding monasteries for fun. But most of that, well, let's be honest, it's either slightly exaggerated or just cinematic nonsense. What they really cared about was being prepared, which meant their equipment had to be practical, reliable, and, let's face it, mostly kinda dull. Let's start with the basics. Clothing. You might imagine Vikings swanning around in furs and leather, looking majestic as they pillaged or traded. And yes, furs were a thing, but not the fluffy, cozy ones you'd think. Mostly, they wore heavy woolen tunics, linen shirts, and trousers that did little to make them look heroic. These fabrics were functional. They kept them warm, absorbed sweat, and could survive months of wear without smelling too unbearable. Comfort, practicality, and resilience. That's what mattered. Not style. Vikings weren't really the trendsetters of Europe, unless your idea of fashion is odor-resistant and layered for snow. Shoes were similarly dull, but essential. Leather shoes, often crudely stitched, sometimes with a bit of wool inside for warmth. Not exactly the height of medieval haute couture, but they didn't fall apart mid-raid. And let's not forget belts, simple leather belts, sometimes used to carry knives or pouches. Functional again. Boring. But without them, you'd have to fumble with every tool you owned, and that's a bad look if you're trying to conquer somewhere in Denmark. Now, armor. Vikings didn't really wear full suits of shiny plate armor. That's a later invention, mostly for knights. Instead, a typical Viking warrior might have a chainmail shirt, called a byrnie, sometimes reaching down to the knees. Heavy, slightly itchy, and prone to rust if you didn't oil it. They might also wear a leather jerkin, which offered some protection but wasn't going to make you invincible. Helmets existed, but again, the whole horned helmet thing? Nope, not historically accurate. It was probably invented by 19th century romantic artists who liked drama. Real Viking helmets were simple, rounded, and effective. Nothing to make your neighbors jealous, but they would keep you from getting a headache from an axe. Shields were a bit more interesting, if only slightly. Typically round, wooden, and reinforced with a metal boss in the center, they were essential for blocking blows. You decorate them sometimes, sure, but mostly for practical reasons. A painted pattern might scare a foe, or at least make them pause long enough for you to swing your weapon. Functional, yet visually dull, just like everything else on this list. Speaking of weapons, let's glide over to those. Vikings were fond of axes, for good reason. They were cheap to make, easy to repair, and useful for both combat and chopping wood. Axes could be enormous or modest, depending on who wielded them. There were also swords, but those were rarer and usually reserved for wealthier warriors. Not because swords were magical, but because they were expensive and required skilled blacksmiths. Spears were common too. Simple wooden shafts with iron tips. Throw one at a target and hopefully it works. Boring, right? But again, essential. Let's pause a moment to appreciate the careful balance here. Everything a Viking carried had a dual purpose: survival and combat. Nothing extra, nothing flashy. A shield had to block, a sword had to cut, boots had to protect. There were no fancy engravings for the sake of it, unless you were rich and really wanted to show off during family feasts. Even then, it was usually subtle. Vikings didn't really have the medieval obsession with showing off through fashion and bling. They had weather, raiding schedules, and long winters to worry about. Ships, of course, were the centerpiece of Viking expeditions. Long ships, sleek and fast, designed to slice through water with minimal fuss. They were practical, capable of both ocean voyages and sneaky river attacks. Not exactly glamorous, unless you consider months at sea with wet socks glamorous. The oars, sails, ropes, and rudders, all necessary, all boring, and all meticulously maintained. A broken rope could ruin a journey, so they took care of them, often obsessively. And let's not forget personal grooming, which was surprisingly part of equipment in a way. Vikings cared about hair, nails, and hygiene, because lice and infections weren't fun during a multi-month raid. Combs, small knives, and even rudimentary razors were part of a warrior's gear. Not the stuff of epic sagas, but essential for not becoming a walking disease vector. Now, food storage. Vikings didn't carry snacks the way we imagine modern adventurers do. No jerky bags or trail mix. Instead, they relied on salted or dried meats, grains, and sometimes fish. Barrels, sacks, and storage vessels were practical, heavy, and dull. But without them, starvation would make your voyage a quick, uncomfortable failure. One might think that this accumulation of boring, functional gear would make Vikings mundane, but the contrast is interesting. Here are these slightly damp, leather-clad, wool-wrapped humans staring across the ocean, planning a raid or trade, armed with simple tools, yet capable of feats that would make later generations marvel. The tools themselves are unglamorous, yet indispensable. A classic case of mundane enabling greatness. Even their signaling equipment had a similar vibe. Fires, horns, and simple flags. No flashing lights or smoke signals from a control tower, just the basics. Effective? Yes. Exciting? Not really. Yet this simplicity allowed them to coordinate raids over rivers and across fjords with surprising efficiency. A dull tool, when used skillfully, becomes almost magical. So, in summary, Viking equipment was boring by design. Every piece served a purpose, every item had to survive months of harsh weather and long voyages. There was little luxury, little extravagance, and definitely no horned helmets in daily use. Yet these tools allowed them to travel, fight, survive, and yes, occasionally terrorize Europe in ways that made later generations write long, slightly dramatic sagas about them. Let's float over to another aspect of Viking life: their personal kits. Beyond weapons and armor, Vikings carried tools for survival. Fire-starting kits, small cooking implements, fishing gear. Sometimes a small hammer, knife, or sewing kit would travel along. Mundane stuff. But when you're far from home, this boring collection of items is the difference between a successful raid and a miserable, hungry retreat. And yes, they had jewelry too, but mostly as currency or status markers, not fashion statements. Silver arm rings, brooches, and pendants were practical. They could be melted down or traded. A Viking wearing a fancy necklace wasn't showing off. He was keeping an emergency currency in case the ocean turned against him. So, the takeaway from all this, in a calm, bedtime sort of way, is that Viking equipment was the unsung hero of Norse expansion. Dull, practical, functional, and necessary. Without it, long ships wouldn't float, shields wouldn't block, and axes wouldn't cut. They might still be called Vikings, but probably from the comfort of their local fjord, complaining about the cold instead of terrorizing monasteries. We'll continue to drift through the rest of Viking gear in the next segment, looking at some slightly quirkier items like personal charms, hunting tools, and minor weapons. But for now, let's just imagine a Viking, warrior, bundled in wool, hefting a shield, rowing across a gray sea, and consider the quiet, boring genius that made all of it possible.
Part 2. Viking Personal Gear. Quirky, mundane, yet surprisingly effective. Welcome back, friends. Settle in, maybe stretch your legs just a little, and let's continue our gentle exploration of Viking equipment. Last time we covered the essentials: armor, shields, ships, and practical clothing. Tonight we take a closer look at the slightly quirkier side of Viking life. The tools and personal items that weren't exactly glamorous, but somehow gave Norsemen a small edge, or at least helped them avoid freezing to death in a fjord. Let's start with something that seems small, but was surprisingly important: belts and pouches. I know belts don't sound thrilling, but consider this. A belt could carry your knife, a small pouch of coins, maybe a whetstone, or even a tiny sewing kit. In other words, the Vikings were very early fans of everything in one place. A misplaced knife could mean the difference between finishing your stew and gnawing on a frozen fish. Pouches were often leather, sometimes roughly stitched, sometimes patched repeatedly, because leather wasn't cheap. The more patched a pouch was, the more experienced its owner probably was. A torn pouch wasn't just unsightly, it was mildly dangerous. Next up, let's glide to Viking jewelry. As mentioned before, this wasn't exactly a fashion statement. Vikings didn't wear brooches to impress neighbors, although maybe they did, quietly. Arm rings, pendants, and brooches often doubled as currency. You could melt down silver into coins if you needed to buy supplies mid-raid. So yes, Vikings were basically carrying wearable ATMs. Practical, clever, and from a modern point of view, somewhat nerdy. You don't think of raiders as financially savvy, but here we are. Now, charms and amulets. Vikings were nothing if not slightly superstitious, and their personal gear reflected that. Thor's hammer pendants, rune-inscribed charms, and small carved figures were common. Did they believe these items would protect them in battle? Possibly. Did it actually work? Well, that depends on whether you consider surviving a sea voyage a victory. Mostly, these charms were a combination of religious devotion, personal superstition, and a subtle reminder to themselves that the gods were watching. Imagine a Viking rowing across a choppy sea, glancing down at his tiny hammer necklace and nodding in quiet confidence. Sweet, understated, and slightly boring. Speaking of slightly boring but necessary, let's talk about fire-starting tools. Vikings didn't have lighters. They had flint, steel, and tinder, usually carried in a small pouch. This is another great example of mundane genius. A damp forest or a cold morning without fire could end a raid before it even started. So flint kits were essential, and every Viking probably had one tucked away somewhere. Not glamorous, not exciting, but a literal safe life. Cooking implements were similarly modest: small cauldrons, wooden spoons, and perhaps a knife for cutting meat. When Vikings landed somewhere for weeks at a time, they needed to cook. And I'm sure you'll agree, there's something comforting in imagining a Viking quietly stirring a stew after a long day of rowing. Not heroic, not epic, just quietly competent. Fishing tools were another quirky but essential part of their personal kit. Nets, hooks, and simple rods made catching dinner possible. While we often think of Vikings as plundering everything in sight, the reality is they fished, trapped, and hunted when they could. Imagine a Viking casting a net at dawn, waiting patiently as cold wind nips at his fingers, silently hoping the fish cooperate. Glamorous? No. Effective? Absolutely. Let's float over to weapons again, but with a twist. Beyond axes, swords, and spears, Vikings sometimes carried small specialized tools: throwing knives, hunting daggers, or short, multi-purpose blades. These weren't meant to impress. They were the sort of tools that quietly solved problems. Maybe you needed to skin a fish, maybe to tighten a rope, maybe to gently poke a suspicious goat. Vikings had a small, curated collection of tools that made their lives slightly easier, slightly safer, and slightly less smelly. Another interesting, often overlooked aspect was Viking writing tools. Not every Norseman could write, but some did. Small pieces of wood, bone, or lead could serve as writing tablets or runic slates. Messages could be left for allies, directions marked, or even simple financial notes. In the middle of a cold, wet raiding season, scribbling on a piece of wood might not seem glamorous, but it helped keep logistics under control. And in the Viking world, keeping track of supplies or trade deals was crucial. Moving on to minor personal comforts, Vikings sometimes carried combs, tweezers, and even rudimentary ear cleaning tools. These were practical hygiene items, small and often carved from bone. In the middle of a long voyage or winter encampment, they made daily life just slightly more bearable. Again, not exciting, not romantic, but quietly effective. The Viking who looked halfway decent probably owed it to a tiny bone comb, a fact seldom mentioned in dramatic sagas. Let's gently touch on sleeping arrangements. Vikings had to sleep on ships, in tents, or in temporary shelters. Personal bedding could include furs, simple mats, and blankets. Not luxurious, but again, functional. Comfort in harsh climates mattered more than style. Imagine drifting to sleep on a damp mat with a wool blanket, listening to the creaking of a longship. Boring? Perhaps. Essential? Definitely. We can't ignore their tools for water travel, which extended beyond the ship itself. Ropes, pulleys, and anchors were carefully tended. Every Viking ship had a meticulously maintained collection of ropes, often braided by hand. A snapped rope could strand them miles from shore. So, even though rope is dull, maintaining it was a full-time task. A practical Viking might spend hours braiding or inspecting ropes. Not thrilling, but critical for survival. Fishing, cooking, and personal comfort aside, let's briefly discuss Viking trade tools. Scales, weights, and small balances allowed Vikings to trade silver, furs, and other goods fairly, or at least appear fair. Merchants might travel light, but accuracy mattered. Weights could be small and mundane, but miscalculate, and suddenly you're hated by every trader from Norway to England. Boring, precise, and subtly stressful. Finally, let's reflect on all of this in a calming way. Viking personal equipment was functional, mundane, and meticulously maintained. Every tool, from the smallest knife to the heaviest chainmail, had a purpose. None of it was flashy for the sake of being flashy, and most of it was slightly uncomfortable, slightly inconvenient, but absolutely necessary. The Vikings weren't heroic because their equipment was exciting. They were heroic because they made the most of dull, practical tools under harsh conditions. The quiet genius of functional, well-maintained gear allowed them to row across stormy seas, survive freezing winters, and occasionally be slightly terrifying to unprepared neighbors. So, as we close this segment, picture a Viking quietly tending to his chainmail, sharpening a knife, braiding rope, and maybe straightening a small pendant around his neck. Boring to an outsider, perhaps. Essential, completely. Effective, without a doubt.
Part 3. Viking siege tools, minor weapons, and the unexciting art of conquest. Welcome back, friends. If you're still awake, that's impressive. Or perhaps the gentle monotone of history is just doing its work. Either way, settle in, make sure your blanket is tucked around your ankles, and let's drift slowly into a slightly less glamorous but essential side of Viking conquest: siege tools and minor weapons. Yes, this is the part of history no one writes songs about, but it's crucial. Without these, those epic raids would have mostly ended in mildly embarrassing retreats. Let's start with siege tools, or, more accurately, their very basic equivalents. Vikings weren't engineers in the Roman sense, and they didn't haul giant trebuchets across Scandinavia. Mostly, their siege equipment was simple: ladders, battering tools, and occasionally wooden beams for makeshift rams. The ladders were essential for scaling walls, yes, but heavy, awkward, and often the source of minor accidents. Imagine a Viking gently attempting to lift a wooden ladder over a muddy ditch while the wind threatens to knock it over. Not exactly cinematic, but it worked. Battering tools were equally mundane. Large wooden beams, or even logs, were used to knock down gates or weak structures. Nothing shiny, nothing particularly sturdy beyond a bit of brute force. A Viking swing might crack a door if it was rotten enough. And yes, sometimes it didn't work, leading to awkward moments of standing around, muttering, and hoping the defenders didn't notice. Subtle, quiet tension, very calm, very bedtime friendly. Sometimes minor fortifications required simple hooks, ropes, and grapples to pull down doors or walls. Again, nothing glamorous. These were carried alongside the usual gear: axes, shields, and knives, because if a rope snapped, you'd wish you'd packed 3 more just to be safe. Practicality ruled. Boring? Absolutely. Necessary? Completely. Now let's drift gently to minor weapons. Beyond the classic axe, sword, and spear, Vikings often carried small, specialized tools for specific situations. Throwing knives were one example. Small, easy to carry, and useful if you needed to distract an enemy from a slightly inconvenient distance. Not cinematic, not heroic, but quietly effective. Then there were hunting daggers, which doubled as utility knives. Skin an animal, repair a shoe, or poke at suspicious lumps of meat in a barrel. You name it. These were multi-purpose tools disguised as weapons. A clever Viking could do more with a small dagger than a modern hero could do with a sword, though it wouldn't make for exciting storytelling. Fishing spears, slings, and even small hammers rounded out the minor arsenal. Useful for survival, sometimes for combat, often for quiet, tedious tasks that, if done incorrectly, could ruin a day or a week of raiding. Boring, effective, and essential. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the contrast here. Popular imagination often pictures Vikings as glamorous, unstoppable raiders, but in reality, they were pragmatic. Ladders could slip, beams could break, daggers could dull, and fishing spears were sometimes just for dinner. The real heroism was in patiently managing these mundane items, day after day, winter after winter. Quiet, steady, unexciting heroism. Viking ships played a role here too, not just for travel, but as floating supply depots. Everything from ropes to food barrels to spare blades had to be carefully stowed and maintained. Ships were almost like small warehouses on water, designed to hold all the boring, essential gear. A small mistake, a forgotten rope, a wet sack of grain, could lead to delays, grumbling crews, or mildly damp food. Again, not glamorous, but necessary. And speaking of mundane preparation, let's talk about personal protection beyond the shield. Leather gloves, padded tunics, and woolen hoods were often worn under armor or during long rowing sessions. Nothing heroic, just comfort and survival. The Viking who skipped these was likely to complain loudly about frostbite rather than perform any dramatic feats of valor. Communication during raids was also surprisingly boring. No modern radios, of course. Instead, Vikings relied on horns, signals, or shouted commands. Horns were effective, but limited. A poorly timed blast could confuse your allies rather than warn them. So, meticulous timing, careful listening, and a little luck were all necessary. Boring? Yes. Effective? Mostly. Now, let's drift into tools for everyday maintenance, which often doubled as survival equipment. Hammers for repairs, chisels for woodwork, ropes for tying everything from barrels to ladders. These mundane tools were quietly heroic in their own way. Imagine a Viking carefully repairing a plank on a ship in the early morning drizzle. Not thrilling, essential. And in a subtle, understated way, kind of impressive. Another quietly important category, containers. Barrels, sacks, baskets, and pouches were everywhere. They stored food, tools, coins, and occasionally small charms or personal items. Proper storage prevented spoilage, loss, and minor disasters. A Viking who neglected his containers might find his precious salted meat floating in seawater. Not dramatic, but mildly tragic. We should also note the importance of maintenance tools for weapons and armor, whetstones for sharpening blades, oil for chainmail, leather straps for repairs. None of this is exciting. None of it would make it into a saga. But try swinging a dull sword or rowing with a broken oar, and you'll understand why Vikings quietly obsessed over these items. In fact, maintenance often dominated a Viking's day more than actual fighting. Sharpening, repairing, cleaning, boring, repetitive tasks that nobody sings songs about. Yet without this boring discipline, the flashy part of history, the raids and conquests, wouldn't happen at all. A dull blade is useless. A leaky ship is mildly inconvenient, but potentially disastrous. A forgotten rope can ruin a perfectly timed operation. These quiet, mundane tasks were the real backbone of Viking life. So as we float to a close on this segment, imagine a Viking quietly tending to his ladder, sharpening his dagger, checking ropes, and adjusting his pouches. The battles and conquests are overhyped. The real story is this: careful preparation, mundane tools, and a stubborn commitment to boring but essential tasks. Without them, no long ships, no raids, no sagas. Just damp, uncomfortable Scandinavians complaining about frostbite. So, in summary, Viking minor weapons and siege tools were functional, practical, and yes, boring. They weren't glamorous. They weren't dramatic, but they were necessary. And in a slow, calm way, that's kind of admirable. Efficiency, practicality, and quiet competence, Viking style. So let's take a deep breath. Imagine the gentle creak of a ship, the muted clang of tools, and the patient, quiet work of Vikings preparing for yet another slightly inconvenient raid. Not heroic in the cinematic sense, heroic in the patient, boring, effective sense.
Part 4. Viking Survival Gear, Personal Quirks, and the Quiet Genius of Conquest. Welcome back, friends. You've made it this far, and that's impressive. Or perhaps the monotone has lulled you into perfect Viking-level patience. Either way, let's settle in and explore the final piece of our Viking equipment story, the survival gear, personal quirks, and understated genius that made their expeditions possible. We've already covered weapons, ships, ladders, and minor tools. But the Vikings' true success often lay in the small, boring details that modern audiences rarely appreciate. Survival gear, for instance? Let's start with something simple: blankets and bedding. Vikings slept on ships, in tents, or under open skies, depending on weather and circumstance. Woolen blankets, furs, and simple mats were the standard. Not luxurious, not heroic, but essential for surviving nights near freezing water or on snow-dusted shores. Comfort in extreme conditions mattered more than dramatics. Imagine a Viking carefully arranging furs, sighing softly as he nestles into them. Not glamorous, absolutely necessary. Food preservation was another quietly genius area. Vikings relied heavily on salted meats, dried fish, and hard grains. Barrels and sacks held these supplies, carefully sealed to prevent spoilage. They were practical and occasionally mildly boring. But without proper storage, weeks at sea would become weeks of soggy, unpleasant meals, hardly inspiring anyone to write a saga about it. Vikings knew this. They valued function over flair. Hunting and fishing tools were equally understated. Nets, hooks, rods, and small spears ensured they could supplement their food supply. These items were simple, lightweight, and multi-purpose. They weren't epic weapons, they weren't flashy, but a Viking who could catch his own dinner quietly increased his chances of surviving the next storm, raid, or long winter. Patience, persistence, and practicality were the real heroes here. Personal quirks often appeared in subtle ways. Some Vikings had favorite knives, carefully carved combs, or amulets with sentimental or religious significance. Others maintained small, practical rituals, checking ropes before dawn, inspecting oars, or sharpening tools while staring at the horizon. None of this is dramatic, none of it makes it into songs, but it shows a quiet discipline and meticulous care. Vikings weren't reckless madmen. Most of the time, they were obsessively practical, slightly superstitious, and mildly fussy about minor details. Let's drift to the topic of clothing again, because it's worth noting how much of survival depended on it. Wool and linen tunics, leather shoes, and belts weren't just functional, they were slightly customizable. Extra layers for cold, tighter belts for rowing, hoods to keep wind off your ears. Vikings experimented quietly with layering and fit, optimizing for efficiency and warmth. Boring? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. Even hygiene items were subtly genius. Combs, tweezers, and small grooming tools weren't just for vanity. They prevented lice, infections, and minor irritations that could ruin a long voyage. Vikings cared about looking moderately presentable. Not for Instagram, obviously, but because a healthy, slightly clean warrior is a more reliable warrior. A small detail, quietly crucial. Another understated area was navigation gear. Beyond the ship itself, Vikings relied on landmarks, sun positions, and even rudimentary compasses like sunstones, if you want to get slightly mystical. Nothing flashy, no GPS, just careful observation. They made mental maps, noted currents, and kept their vessels in good condition. The excitement comes later in stories. In real life, it was patience, attention, and repetitive observation. Very slow-paced, very dull, but indispensable. Tools for repair and maintenance were a constant companion. Hammers, chisels, spare rivets, ropes, and leather strips allowed Vikings to fix almost anything on the go. A broken oar, a leaking ship, a torn sail, minor disasters without proper preparation. Vikings obsessively maintained their tools, their ships, and their weapons. The glamorous moments, raiding, trading, exploring, depended entirely on this boring, meticulous work. Now let's drift to minor survival items. Flint and steel for fire, small cooking pots, and containers for water or grain. Each piece was carefully chosen for portability, durability, and practicality. Vikings weren't carrying anything extra because extra weight meant slower rowing and greater exhaustion. They optimized for necessity, function over flair. Boring? Yes. Crucial? Definitely. Even minor personal charms had a subtle utility. Thor's hammer pendants, rune carvings, and small talismans were often morale boosters, reminders of home, or symbols of protection. They were quietly comforting, slightly superstitious, and occasionally served as emergency currency. Imagine a Viking clutching a tiny charm while rowing in the pre-dawn cold. Not epic, but psychologically significant. Let's pause for a moment to reflect on the overall picture. Vikings weren't glamorous raiders in the sense movies make them out to be. They were obsessively practical, careful, and slightly quirky in ways that modern audiences might find charming if you ignore the occasional bloodshed. They succeeded not because of flashy heroism, but because they managed small, boring details extraordinarily well. A well-maintained ship, sharpened weapons, food that wouldn't spoil, clothing that kept you alive, and minor charms to boost morale. These were the unsung heroes of Norse conquests. Their personal quirks also included a surprising amount of self-discipline. Vikings were patient, methodical, and observant. They might row for hours, maintaining rhythm, checking ropes, sharpening knives, and glancing at distant shorelines for potential threats or opportunities. The drama in sagas comes later. In real life, it was patience, meticulous, and slightly boring preparation that made those dramatic moments possible. Even minor mistakes highlight their careful planning. A forgotten rope, a poorly sharpened axe, or a damp barrel of grain could mildly ruin a raid. And yet they survived. Somehow, they made it work. The quiet genius of Viking life is exactly that. They combined mundane preparation, slightly quirky personal habits, and essential gear into a system that allowed them to succeed against significant odds. Not glamorous, not flashy, quietly effective. So, as you settle into your blanket, maybe take a deep breath and imagine a Viking quietly finishing his morning chores, preparing for another calm, functional day at sea. Not exciting, not thrilling, perfect for bedtime history. And with that, our slow, peaceful journey through the mundane brilliance of Viking equipment comes to a close. Rest easy. You've earned it.